Howdy, all y'all. So as Doug pointed out, we're here to talk about how we do facilitation in government. The things that we will be discussing today are these 3 words specifically, don't often get combined, especially with that first one, so bureaucracy, how we use curiosity and joy. So as we've already been introduced, I'm Marni.
I'm Ben.
And we've co-founded the Office of Design and Delivery within the city of Austin. We actually have some of our previous flock members in the audience today, which is super cool. We started this to really change how we're putting technology in place. I'm sure you've all tried to use a government service and found it to be incredibly outdated and frustrated.
Yeah.
And so really the test was, can we do this fast? And so we were able to have tangible outcomes very quickly. The most recent thing we just released is forms for filing a complaint or a compliment to police officers. And so when you think about something of that magnitude and sensitivity, there's a lot of facilitation that goes into it. It turns out into a technology form, but there was a lot of work to get here. So a quick exercise to think about how we have to frame things in government. There was recently this article on Route 50 talking about a cashless future, so moving all of our interactions to digital or credit cards, which I myself have stood in a grocery line and rolled my eyes as someone took out a checkbook, thinking about how much longer this is going to take. So I definitely feel that as well. There are a couple of things to keep in mind when we're talking about a cashless future. 28,000 households in Austin are unbanked. They do not have a bank account or a credit card. If you look at this worldwide, it's 2 billion people, and 75% of those live in poverty. If we're talking about how we approach government in the future, we're actually talking about the room where it happens. Who are you including in the room? So I want you to take a minute and think about this, because when I was in a room recently, we had the same recommendation come to us to go completely cashless. It was a room of 35 people. I was brought in at the last minute as a technologist to help consult on it, and I'm the only one that raised their hand when they made this statement and said that we should be going to a cashless future. And I said, what about our unbanked population? Because if we're not taking that into account, you are suddenly increasing inequities throughout the city.
Yeah, so I think there's this question of like what kinds of people should you be including in the room in order to get to the best policy outcomes for residents?
Anybody have any ideas? Yeah.
Sure. Like any specific invite that you would do in order to make sure that it's going to get to all the audiences? Yeah.
I mean, if you're designing a solution, meeting with the team, understanding who do we seek to make this for, and make sure there's a handful of those kind of people in the room with you.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm glad you mentioned design, because there's been a lot of pride lately in the advancement of design as a field at the executive level. So this is an article in Fast Company about designers finally have a seat at the table. And so we should all be very proud of ourselves for like finally getting to the C-suite, and then we should think like designers and think about, wait, why is the meeting happening at a table in the first place? Like how is this convening working out, and who's being included? Because the room is probably missing important perspectives. And I want to include an example that might make you uncomfortable. This is an early meeting of the current presidential administration. So this is a number of technology executives from around the country meeting with the president-elect. I personally am very represented in this room. It's pretty male and pretty pale. This room is probably totally cool with a cashless future. And as we talk about what is the future of technology in the country on public policy, there's so many levers in government that can be done overnight or within 2 years that dramatically change markets. And so we need to be really careful about how we can affect the attendance in the room. And then the rest of this talk really is changing the nature of the conversation so that it's open and inviting for everyone involved. So the first part about that is curiosity, which is a word that you don't really hear often with government. Most of the time in government, it's like, this is how we've always done things. There's this fear of changing the status quo, of possibly getting fired for challenging your manager. And that's because curiosity requires courage. It requires being able to think that to have that that environment of psychological safety so that you can come up with these crazy ideas. And so across the city of Austin, a lot of these activities that we do are trying to create that culture of psychological safety where, like, look, this is a meeting where people are smiling and laughing and leaning in and thinking about what's the best way to move forward with an exercise. And one important thing to note is that it's about being positive about the great ideas and the possible futures, but it's also about inviting the negative possibilities of questioning why might this fail.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting when you're in bureaucracy is a lot of times the decisions on what projects are going forward are made at the executive level. It's been decided, and they're getting pushed down to the actual worker bees, the people that are going to implement, and they have no say on whether it goes forward. So it's really important when you have a team that is going to have to actually do implementation to give them the space to actually say why they think there are barriers or challenges to this actually being a success. And once you open that floor, it can become a conversation back and forth. They're much more comfortable actually going forward because they've been able to present those challenges, they've been heard, and it's something we can talk about as we continue on the project.
Yeah, because those people usually are the ones with their arms crossed. And so you say, like, okay, you look like you don't think this is going to be successful. How might it fail? And suddenly the conversation is what they actually want to talk about, which is why this is a terrible idea and it should never have been mandated. And we need to talk about that. And sometimes one of the things, too, that we challenge our employees is, like, if this is a bad idea, we should tell council that it's a bad idea. Like, there's only 10 of them and a mayor, and we know all of their names. I used to work at the federal government where it's much harder to go in front of Congress and tell them that something's a bad idea. But if you guys aren't familiar with the Austin City Council, they're actually really wonderful people. And so there's really curious things about how can we change the nature of government and the relationship between employees and the highest level. In this process, we have this really simple definition of what it means to be agile. And this is a process of trying things and learning based off of what you try, just doing and learning. It's a matter of if you have a good idea, just try it. If you're not sure where to start, then do some more research and learn. Really have these quick learning loops.
Yeah, so also curiosity feeds on context. This is the inbox to the austintexas.gov team. And one of the statements here is this is probably the worst website to navigate. If you are a designer, is like a gold mine of, hey, it's time for us to change. But when you're talking about government, they're like, get in line. It takes everybody this long. You're just lazy. And so that's one thing we have a really big clue on in government is when you hear the word lazy, they don't actually understand how to nudge those people in the right direction. And also, curiosity can be cautious.
Yeah, so there's, Priya actually got to this point a little bit, but sometimes it's not the best idea to bring everyone into the room to talk about the problem. Maybe that's not the best first interaction or facilitation. So there's examples of, we did work, like Marni mentioned, around police oversight in Austin. My colleague at Brown did the world's largest randomized controlled trial of police-worn body cameras in the District of Columbia. And he reached out to the ACLU, the police union, Black Lives Matter. Everyone sort of had this sense of, like, we're never going to agree on this. But his big thing was, like, we're going to use science, we're going to use the scientific method and do a randomized controlled trial, and met with these groups individually and said, hey, if we make a decision based on these results, and this is how we do the trial, will you respect that decision? And their answer is, like, well, the other people won't. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But would you respect that decision? And they're like, well, sure, I would. And he was able to, in separate meetings, to get everyone to agree on the same methodology, and then be able to say, hey, it turns out you all agree that this is the right method. And at the end of the study, they actually found that in the District of Columbia, police-worn body cameras did not actually change police behavior in a significant way, in the way that they define significance in the early process. And everybody from the police to the community actually agreed with that result, and there was greater trust involved with everyone afterward. So that point of, like, sometimes you can have these meetings in separate rooms. And there's similar stuff that we did in the city of Austin around trying to define whether we need to include technical terms in permitting recommendations. And so trying to introduce what the concept of impervious cover is to residents. And one of the big things was like, let's just design it and show, here's an example of how it could be shown on a website. And by showing that artifact, that was able to move the conversation along, much more so than a facilitation where you put everyone in the room and get them to agree sort of conceptually. Let's talk about joy.
So we try to embrace the absurd when we're talking about creating psychological safety, especially in government. Offering an absurd environment really does help with that. It gives them the space to actually throw out crazy ideas. So, like we said before, we created the Office of Design and Delivery. If you haven't noticed, the acronym is ODD, so we're keeping Austin odd. Our mascot is a love chicken because a bunch of people have chickens and we love chickens. We like to have parties where we make cookies out of them. And we borrow this from the US Digital Services. So they have a crab as a mascot, which is super fun and playful and makes people think that maybe government can be fun. This is their administrator, Matt Cutts, dressed up as the crab, because, again, sometimes you embrace the absurd.
Yeah, our Twitter handle is Civic Queso, which appreciates Austin's civic tech community as well as our appreciation for queso. And then in Rhode Island, we just launched, we're launching a podcast with a mascot, which is a narwhal, to respect Rhode Island's history of whaling as well as the unicorns of the sea. And then another event that happened in the District of Columbia was to bringing policymakers and community members and academics all together around improving government forms. They called it Formapalooza. At one point, they had 100 people in a room shouting, "Forms, forms, forms."
Yeah, so one of the things that we recently had written about was that we're saying, or basically that Office of Design and Delivery said corporate workshops should not be awful. So this is another way of bringing joy. And so we had a team, one of them is here, Ashley Harris. If you have questions about this work, please ask her because she can tell you more. They created these workshops that we call fun shops because work should be fun. And people walked out saying, wow, this is really changing the approach to my work. We did not put that in. Then we also have the design guide that Ashley also helped create. And it's the fun metaphor of talking about content strategy as the components of a breakfast taco. So again, just making it fun. And then always and continuously talking to our community. And having parties. And celebrating people's lives. And having dogs in meetings, it's another important one that helps bring embrace the absurd.
The dog in that photo is just taking the meeting so seriously. It's
Yes.
part of the.
And then also, again, having a massive celebrations and remembering to have fun with the community that we're in.
Yeah, so this again gets at this doing and learning, like a lot of this culture stuff we've been introducing just in the past 3 years in local government. And so it's not perfect, and we really do think about the design process in designing the culture around these meetings, around these conversations and projects as well. Going to end with a presidential quote, back when presidential quotes sounded presidential. This was said actually just 40 miles away from here at the LBJ Ranch. And it gets at the spirit of what we were saying at the very beginning, that if we really want to control the room toward the outcomes we want, we need to be really thoughtful about who is in the room. And if we want to solve this together, then we need to actively include people who don't look and think like ourselves.